Hello, everybody, and welcome to what is the last of the Women in History series, The Fight for the Vote. So the first thing we have to ask is, who can claim to be the first feminist to campaign actively for women to get the vote? It's not an easy question to answer because in the early 19th century, the vote came a long way down the list of priorities for pioneer feminists. As we've seen, Mary Wollstonecraft herself wasn't interested in it, and this was understandable in an era when women struggled against so many other disabilities. One possible claimant to be the first suffragist was Harriet Taylor, the long-term mistress and eventually wife of the philosopher John Stuart Mill. Her most famous work, The Enfranchisement of Women, is a powerful plea for equality of the sexes in education and the professions, but not specifically in politics. And anyway, the book had to be published under Mill's name. She probably also wrote much of his most famous philosophical work on liberty, but she never received any of the credit. It was her influence on her husband that counted, persuading him to become the first man to take up the suffragist cause. A woman who was much more outspoken in support for the vote was Lydia Becker. Becker, a distinguished amateur scientist who corresponded with Darwin, founded the Manchester Suffrage Society in 1867, one of the first of its kind. It soon attracted considerable support from men as well as women, including a local doctor called Richard Pankhurst, of whom more later. The Manchester Society eventually evolved into a national society, and in 1870 Lydia founded the Women's Suffrage Journal to campaign for the vote. Another early suffragist, and an exact contemporary of Lydia Becker, was Barbara Bodichon. She had an unusual background in that she was the illegitimate daughter of a Derbyshire milliner. This would normally have precluded her from playing any active role in public life, but her father, a radical MP, was prepared to recognise her, treat her equally with his other children, and give her an independent income. In the 1850s, she founded a female discussion group in London called the Ladies of Langham Place, who were all interested in advancing the rights of women by promoting education and the removal of legal disabilities. By the 1860s, with parliamentary reform on the agenda once more, they'd moved on to the question of women having the vote. Other members of the group included Emily Davis, the later founder of Girton College at Cambridge, and the pioneer doctor Elizabeth Garrett Anderson. Elizabeth had a younger sister called Millicent, who, although only 19, was allowed to sit in on their meetings. And Millicent Fawcett, as she was eventually to become, was to outshine them all. She was born in 1847, the 8th of 10 children. Her older sister Elizabeth was the second, at Aldborough in Suffolk, the daughter of Henry Garrett, a self-made man who'd started as a pawnbroker and acquired a fortune. He owned the famous maltings at Snape, where she spent much of her childhood. Henry, a conservative turned liberal, was the dominant figure in the family, and he was interested in the education of his daughters and encouraged them to speak their minds and engage in political debates around the dinner table. "I cannot say I became a suffragist," Millicent said later. "I already was one, from the time I was old enough to think at all about the principles of representative government." At the age of 12, she was sent with her older sister to a private boarding school in Blackheath, kept by the great aunt of the poet Robert Browning. Elizabeth began attending lectures in London by famous figures of the day, like the Christian socialist F.D. Morris and John Stuart Mill, and she took Millicent along with her. They were introduced to Mill, and Mill introduced Millicent, in turn, to a young economics professor and Liberal Member of Parliament, Henry Fawcett. Fawcett was a supporter of many radical causes, not just votes for women, but others like proportional representation, which, of course, still haven't been achieved. And he also flirted with republicanism. He'd previously wanted to marry Elizabeth, but she turned him down in favour of pursuing her medical career. So he turned to her younger sister, and Millicent, though still only 18, accepted him. He was 32. It was an unusual marriage because Henry was totally blind, the result of a shooting accident. Millicent became his eyes, and they formed a close partnership based more on intellectual sympathy than, it seems, than passion. Henry encouraged her in her aspirations, and she began to pursue the cause of women's suffrage in earnest. Emily Davis is supposed to have said to her, "I'll open up higher education to women, your sister will open up the medical profession, and you, Millie, being younger than us, you must get us the vote." And at the age of 22, she set out to do that, though it's to prove a long and rocky road. As a first step, she became involved in collecting names for the great petition which Mill would present to Parliament, calling for the enfranchisement of women householders. Here at the very start, the campaign ran into the difficulty that dogged it all the way through. Most men did not have the vote. The suffrage was based on a property qualification, and by and large women didn't own property. The Second Reform Act of 1867 widened the franchise to give all urban householders the vote, but how many of them were women? The answer was very few, widows and some unmarried women. The vast majority of women were married, and legally all property of a marriage belonged to the husband. This was taken to absurd lengths, as when Millicent had her purse stolen, she found it recorded by the police as theft of the property of her husband. To give any married woman the vote would undermine the principles on which the whole system rested, and give women an unfair advantage over men, or so it could be claimed. In the 1860s, this didn't matter, because the petition was overwhelmingly rejected. Votes for women was simply not practical politics, yet. When that changed, it mattered a lot. Millicent had a lot on her plate at this point. She had to care for Henry and to run his two households, one in Cambridge and the other in London, and she was pregnant. Their daughter and only child, Philippa, was born in 1868 and grew up to be a distinguished mathematician. But Millicent continued with her campaign for the vote. In 1869, she spoke for the first time in public at the first pro-suffrage meeting to be held in London. In 1870, she spoke again in Brighton, her husband's constituency, and she began to tour the country, always hammering home at the same simple points. First, she listed the objections to the idea of votes for women. Women were intellectually inferior. They were physically inferior. Giving them the vote would sully their purity, make them mannish, lead them to neglect their families and children. Men would no longer respect them, might not even hold doors open for them. Besides, proper women didn't want the vote or take an interest in politics. It was only a noisy minority. One by one, Millicent would demolish these arguments with a mixture of reasoned argument and humour. It was a very effective strategy, although she never became an exciting speaker like Josephine Butler or Emmeline Pankhurst later on. And unlike Josephine, a woman she revered, she never took up controversial causes like child prostitution. She was never prepared to step too far outside the modest behaviour expected of Victorian women, because she wanted to use her skills as a lobbyist to win powerful men to her cause, not alienate them. She was always known in public as Mrs. Henry Fawcett. But it didn't prevent her, as one of the most well-known suffragists, being the butt of jokes by those men, most of them, who considered the whole idea of female suffrage ridiculous. The whole time she was campaigning, she was also helping her husband in his work of popularising economics, contributing 8 essays to one of his books and publishing her own short introduction to political economy. In 1875, she cooperated with Anne Clough and Josephine Butler to found what became Newnham College at Cambridge. And as well as caring for Henry and Philippa, she was responsible for the upbringing of 4 orphaned cousins, to whom she became almost a substitute mother. In 1880, Henry, despite his blindness, was offered a seat in the cabinet by Gladstone and became the Postmaster General. He was a successful one, introducing the post office savings stamp, parcel post and the postal order. But in 1884, his career and his life were to be cut short. Aged only 51, he died suddenly of pleurisy. Millicent was devastated. They'd been an inseparable couple, immortalised in a famous portrait by the pre-Raphaelite Ford Madox Brown. For a time, she withdrew from public life. She sold both homes and moved in with her sister at the house in Gower Street, which now bears the blue plaque to her memory. She continued with her writing, churning out many books, including a biography of Queen Victoria, and most famously now rediscovering and bringing out a new edition of Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Gradually, she took up the cause of the suffrage again, and on the death of Lydia Becker in 1890, she took over as chairman of the National Society for Women's Suffrage. In 1897, this merged with other organisations to form the NUWSS, the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. This was always to remain by far the largest of suffragist organisations, with Millicent at the undisputed head of it. But by this stage, her views were beginning to seem out of date to many younger feminists. She remained an old-fashioned, laissez-faire liberal, opposing the idea of school meals, family allowances, and other ideas for state intervention to improve the lot of women. She even opposed legislation to protect women working in factories like the notorious match girls. In her view, women should not get any extra privileges that weren't also available to men. Always fiercely patriotic, she broke with the Liberal Party over Irish Home Rule and became a liberal unionist. Proud of the achievements of the Empire, she supported British actions in South Africa during the Boer War. So she seemed a safe pair of hands when the Conservative government wanted someone to go out there to investigate conditions in the concentration camps. The idea was for her to refute the reports sent back by Emily Hobhouse, which drew attention to the appalling sufferings of women and children in the camps. But when she got there, she was shocked by what she found, and her report ended up endorsing much of what Hobhouse had reported. By this time, the movement for the political enfranchisement of women had considerable success. This is often overlooked because it took place in the field of local government. The very first legislation to give some women the vote was as far back as 1869, the Municipal Franchise Act, giving the vote to unmarried women householders, of which of course there weren't many. But gradually the numbers increased. Women ratepayers were given the right to vote in the elections for boards of guardians, which ran the workhouses, and for school boards. As the law was changed to give married women the right to keep their property during marriage, the distinction between married and unmarried began to appear anachronistic, and the Local Government Act of 1894 enfranchised some married women for the first time. It crucially also allowed women to stand for election and become councillors themselves, although it took until 1907 before Elizabeth Garrett Anderson became the first woman mayor of her and Millicent's hometown of Aldborough. Many women, most famously Emmeline Pankhurst, were now able to cut their political teeth as councillors or guardians. These successes, of course, made it all the more glaring that the citadel of the House of Commons was still out of women's reach. MPs refused to budge. Suffrage bills were introduced, and all fell by the wayside. But attitudes were changing, and Britain was beginning to fall behind other English-speaking countries. Wyoming Territory in the US had given women the vote as far back as 1869, and in 1893 New Zealand followed suit. The new Australian Federation enfranchised women right from the start. By the early 1900s, it was beginning to be agreed that by MPs that something ought to be done about the female suffrage. But what exactly? Even if a measure could be agreed and got through the Commons, the House of Lords, resolutely all male and opposed to any kind of progressive legislation, would be bound to throw it out. By this time, Millicent had broken with the Liberal Unionists and adopted a neutral position. The NUWSS would support any reasonable compromise which would give some women the vote, even though it wouldn't be as many as they'd like. This was opposed by many of her own supporters, who wanted all or nothing, the position the Labour movement had always taken. All women should have the vote, and of course all men too. But to many Tories, the idea of universal suffrage was still anathema and smacked of revolution. Other Conservatives could see that there might be advantages to giving votes to women property owners, since they were likely to be middle class and wealthy and would probably vote Conservative. And this, of course, is precisely what the Liberals, out of power for years, feared. So creating a compromise between these differing views was going to be almost impossible. It was frustration with this deadlock and a belief that if women were ever to get the vote, men would have to be given a shove, which decided a hitherto unknown woman called Emmeline Pankhurst to break away from Millicent's organisation and found one of her own. Emmeline Goulden was born in the Moss Side area of Manchester on the 15th of July 1858, although she later claimed she'd been born on the 14th of July and said she identified with the French revolutionaries who stormed the Bastille. Both her father and mother came from intensely political families. Her mother was from the Isle of Man, and her family had been involved in the agitation which resulted in the island receiving Home Rule and granting women the vote as early as 1881. Her father's family had been involved with the Anti-Corn Law League, and her grandfather had been present at the Peterloo Massacre in 1819. The Gouldens were a modestly well-off merchant family with 10 children. Her father owned a theatre at one stage and was interested in amateur dramatics, and this rubbed off on Emmeline. Her flair for the dramatic was to play an important part in her later career. The children were involved in their parents' social activism from a young age, and Emmeline remembered in her autobiography visiting a bazaar and collecting money for freed American slaves. Inevitably, they supported the northern side in the American Civil War, despite the hardship this caused in Manchester as the North cut off cotton exports from the South. When the famous American abolitionist Henry Ward Beecher visited Manchester, the Gouldens welcomed him, and Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by his sister, Harriet Beecher Stowe, became one of Emmeline's favourite books. She was a voracious reader from a very early age. She's supposed to have read the Odyssey at the age of 9, although such claims are always made for charismatic leaders and must be treated with caution. But she certainly read Pilgrim's Progress and Carlyle's French Revolution, which became major influences. And yet, despite her obvious intelligence, she was not given the same education as her brothers. Although in theory her parents supported women's rights, including the right to vote, in practice they adhered to the old-fashioned view. What a pity she wasn't born a lad, her father is supposed to have said. Education, except homemaking skills, was wasted on a woman, because their fate was to marry and support their husbands. Paid work was out of the question for a middle-class married woman. Despite the campaigns of feminists from Mary Wollstonecraft to Millicent Fawcett, this was still the predominant view in the 1870s. But her mother did subscribe to the Women's Suffrage Journal, and at the age of 14, Emmeline was taken along to a public meeting to be addressed by the editor, the great Lydia Becker herself. Emmeline was enthralled. "I left the meeting a conscious and confirmed suffragist," she wrote. The following year, her father sent her off to a finishing school in Paris to be prepared for marriage. But the school did teach useful things like chemistry and bookkeeping, as well as subjects like embroidery, and Emmeline loved it, and France. She stayed on after the course was over, met real French revolutionaries who'd fought for the Paris Commune in 1871, and thought she'd met her future husband. He actually proposed to her, and she accepted. But when her father refused to provide a dowry, he quickly withdrew his offer, and Emmeline had to return, crestfallen, to Manchester. And then, at the age of 20, she met a man who her parents could approve of. He was a barrister named Richard Pankhurst, a pioneer socialist and a supporter of women's rights. The attraction was mutual. The only snag was he was 44 years old and a bachelor who'd sworn to remain single. Emmeline wasn't having any of that. Even her mother accused her of throwing herself at him. When he proved reluctant to offer her marriage, she suggested they not bother with the ceremony and enter into a free union. He had to point out, gently, that she'd be then regarded as a fallen woman and excluded from social, let alone political life. Eventually he relented, and the couple were married in 1879. They moved into a small terraced house in Old Trafford, and there their first daughter, Christabel, was born in 1880, followed by Estelle, better known as Sylvia, in 1882, and a son, Frank, in 1884. And later there was another daughter, Adela. Despite having young children to care for, Emmeline threw herself into political activities with the Women's Suffrage Society, and the family decided to move to London. Here she set up a fabric shop with her sister, while Richard attempted, unsuccessfully, to become a Member of Parliament. In 1886, tragedy struck when little Frank died of diphtheria. Emmeline was consumed with grief and in the Victorian manner commissioned 2 portraits of the dead boy, but she couldn't bear to look at them and hid them away in a cupboard. She blamed faulty drains for causing his death, and the family moved to a more affluent district where another son was born. His mother believed that he was Frank come again, and he was given the same name as his deceased brother. They were wealthy enough now to employ a butler, and their house in Russell Square became a meeting place for British and foreign intellectuals, including anarchists, socialists, and a wide variety of other activists and free thinkers. But Emmeline never forgot the suffragist cause. In 1888, there was a split in their ranks over the question of whether groups affiliated to political parties like the Women's Liberal Federation should be accepted in the Women's Suffrage Society. When a majority of members said yes, Millicent Fawcett, despite herself being a Liberal, stormed at her angry meeting and together with Lydia Becker formed a new society. Emmeline remained in the Rump organisation, but this too split on the question of whether women should accept the vote if it was confined to unmarried women and widows, or insist on unmarried women getting the vote too. Since there was no chance at this stage of any woman being offered the vote, the argument was entirely theoretical, but the Pankhursts felt strongly enough about it to help set up a breakaway organisation, the Women's Franchise League. The WFL was intended to be a radical organisation, and in some ways it looks forward to the later suffragettes. It sneered at other suffragists as the spinster suffrage party. But despite acquiring some distinguished backers, including Josephine Butler, it was never very successful and folded after only a year. This was a difficult time for Emmeline. Her shop business failed, and the family decided to return to Manchester. But in 1888, she'd been introduced to a young socialist from Scotland named James Keir Hardie. She was impressed by him, and when he was elected to Parliament and founded a new party, the Independent Labour Party, she decided to join. With ILP backing, she now set out to pursue her own political career, independent of her husband. She started by joining a committee for the relief of the unemployed, handing out food to starving men and women in the streets of Manchester. Then she stood for election and was elected to the local Board of Guardians. She was appalled by the conditions she found in the workhouse that she was now responsible for. Pregnant women and girls of 7 or 8 scrubbing floors and doing other hard physical labour. And she campaigned for reform, making a name for herself, at least locally, for the first time. In 1897, she was arrested by the police for taking part in an illegal ILP meeting at Boggart Hole Clough, which is a park, in case you don't know. Richard defended her in court. She was found guilty and fined. She refused to pay. 2 men charged with her were sent to prison, and she could have been too, but the magistrate declined to do so. The idea of respectable middle-class women being sent to jail was still unacceptable. When asked by a reporter whether she was prepared to go to prison, she said, "Why, yes, of course." It was a foretaste of what was to come. Around this time, Richard began to complain of stomach pains. He developed a gastric ulcer, and they moved to the countryside to improve his health. But in 1898, he suffered a relapse. Emmeline was in Switzerland, but receiving an urgent telegram, she hurried home and was on the train from London to Manchester when she saw in a newspaper the announcement of his death. She was 50 years old and found herself a widow, having to deal with a mountain of debt. She moved the family into a smaller house, resigned from the Guardians, and was forced to enter paid employment as a registrar of births, marriages and deaths. The stories her women clients told her about their unhappy lives made her more convinced than ever that something had to be done to improve their lot, and that nothing was likely to happen until they acquired some political power. She re-entered politics herself and was elected to the Manchester School Board. Frustrated that the cause of votes for women seemed to be going nowhere, she resigned from the ILP and decided to found her own organisation, which would be solely open to women. She called it the Women's Social and Political Union, indicating that it was about more than just the suffrage, but gaining the vote would be the essential first step. Unlike the polite lobbying of the NUWSS, this would pursue the cause through direct action. Deeds, not words, would be its motto. The WSPU formally came into existence on the 10th of October 1903 at the Pankhurst home, a little terraced house in Manchester, now the Pankhurst Centre. It was a tiny organisation, basically Emmeline and a few supporters, and its establishment was largely ignored. At first, the WSPU's activities were, despite the claims, not much different from the NUWSS's. They kept the green, white, red Give Women Rights flag of the larger organisation, just changing the red to purple. They made speeches, organised petitions, held rallies and published newsletters, all things that Millicent Fawcett and her supporters had long done. Then Emmeline came up with a novel idea, a women's parliament, which would parallel the sessions of the male one. Meanwhile, in 1904, a highly symbolic event took place. A resolution supporting votes for women for the first time won a majority in the House of Commons, passed by 184 votes to 70. To Millicent, this was an important turning point, an indication that her moderate approach was paying off. To Emmeline, it meant nothing. The number of MPs taking part in the vote was low, and even to those who had voted in favour, the issue was a low priority. Another private member's suffrage bill was introduced, but everyone knew its likely fate. It'd be talked out. Emmeline was determined to mount a protest. When her supporters turned up outside the House of Commons, the police told them to be good and move away. To their astonishment, the women refused. They stood their ground, and scuffles broke out. The event was so astonishing that it became national news. Emmeline became famous for the first time, and there was a surge in membership. This was clearly the way to go, and she now launched a deliberate campaign of what might be called unladylike behaviour to capture public attention. WSPU members turned up at political meetings to heckle the Speaker and cause disruption, forcing the stewards, men of course, to lay hands on them and throw them out. And each time they did this, they produced more publicity and more support for the cause. Emmeline's daughters took the lead in this more militant behaviour, particularly Christabel, who was the first to be arrested for spitting at a policeman in October 1905. During the 1906 election campaign, they continued their tactic of disrupting election meetings, although this made no difference to the actual result, which was a landslide victory for the Liberals. In theory, this made votes for women more of a possibility, but for the House of Lords veto, it probably would have been enacted. It's one of the curiosities of the Pankhurst direct action campaign that it was directed solely at MPs in the House of Commons and not the Lords, which is where more and more WSPU members found themselves up in court and routinely refusing to pay their fines began to be sent to prison, Sylvia and Adela Pankhurst among them. They were now big news, and the press had to invent a name for them. If the NUWSS are the serious suffragists, sneered a Daily Mail journalist, then these silly, hysterical women are the suffragettes. The name stuck, and as so often happens, what was intended to be an insult became a badge of honour. The Pankhurst campaign now became more militant, as it had to be if it was to hold public attention and attract more support. Many of their activities savoured at what in later times would be called publicity stunts. Tired of being moved on when they tried to demonstrate, the suffragettes began chaining themselves to convenient fixtures, most famously park railings, and defying the police to release them. More and more ended up in prison. But there was a price to pay. Although some people were impressed, others, particularly but not exclusively men, were not. A backlash began. Millicent Fawcett and the older suffragists couldn't make head or tail of it all. They should be trying to win people over, not alienating them. For men to go to prison for their political beliefs was nothing new. Only quite recently, many nonconformists had done just that, refusing to pay their rates in protest at the new Education Act. For women to do it was quite another thing. The idea still lingered on that women, middle-class ones at any rate, should be ladylike and not do anything demeaning. But the suffragettes didn't seem bothered by that at all, that they were defying conventions, breaking all the rules and revelling in it. This might have been fun, but was it actually advancing the cause? Millicent Fawcett doubted it. What was the point of disrupting the meetings of MPs who were actually sympathetic to giving women the vote? Wasn't it actually setting the cause back? She could point to the growing movement of women proclaiming openly they didn't want the vote. This movement is often overlooked. It resulted in the creation in 1908 of the Anti-Suffrage League, led by Lady Jersey, significantly the wife of a member of the House of Lords. But this was by no means just an aristocratic organisation. It drew up a monster petition to Parliament with more than 300,000 signatures. Its arguments were the traditional ones, that men and women belonged to separate spheres, and it was the job of men to run the country and women to nurture future generations. And that women, precisely because they weren't involved in politics, could wield their influence behind the scenes, could cross barriers, go into hidden corners and do good directly in a way that men couldn't. But Millicent Fawcett's attitude to the suffragettes, in a sense her rivals, was complex. She couldn't help admiring their courage. They demonstrated what women were capable of. And when the first 10 women prisoners were released, she held a dinner in their honour. And there were soon to be many more prisoners. Though not yet Emmeline herself. She concentrated on building up the organisation, giving up her job, and in 1907 moving to London. She brought into the WSPU a wealthy couple, the Pethick Lawrences, who ran the administration and handled the finances, and money was now pouring in, with subscriptions from members and donations from sympathetic supporters. As the movement grew, it became steadily more authoritarian. It took on the character of a cult, the cult of Emmeline and her daughters. Democracy was squeezed out. Emmeline took all the decisions, and meetings of members were no longer held. Some of her early supporters couldn't stomach this and left the movement, but Emmeline was convinced she was in the right. "We are not a political party," she declared. "We are an army on the march." Her self-righteousness was increased by incidents like that in January 1908, when a group of male Liberal supporters, blaming the suffragettes for the party losing a by-election, attacked her and a friend, spattering them with clay, throwing rotten eggs and stones covered in snow at them, and then giving them a beating. She decided she couldn't stand by while other suffragettes went to prison. She must join them. She went to the House of Commons to deliver a letter of protest to Asquith. Told the Prime Minister wouldn't see her, she refused to leave. She was arrested and jailed for 6 weeks. Photographed in prison wearing her prison clothes, she could be portrayed as a martyr for the cause. The summer of 1908 saw what was perhaps the peak of her influence. A vast rally was held in Hyde Park, which may have attracted as many as 500,000 supporters of Votes for Women, although not all of them may have been her followers. There were speeches by Emmeline herself and other distinguished people like Bernard Shaw. The whole thing passed off peacefully, which many of her more militant followers may have regretted. Some of them marched to Parliament Square and started making speeches. When the police stopped them, 2 of them went round the corner to 10 Downing Street and started throwing stones at the windows. Invited to condemn their behaviour, Emmeline said, on the contrary, she approved of it. At their trial, she made a passionate defence of their actions, justifying breaking the law if it was in the cause of greater civil rights. The women were convicted nonetheless. By 1909, Emmeline decided that a new impetus was needed to prevent the movement running out of steam. And this impetus came from an unlikely place, Tsarist Russia. The 1905 revolution had focused attention on what went on in that country. There, of course, women had been prominent in the ranks of revolutionaries for decades. Arrested, they claimed the status of political prisoners, and if they were denied it, they went on hunger strike. The suffragettes now brought this tactic to Britain. Even men had never deliberately starved themselves in prison as a political weapon before, not even in Ireland. And it was a devastating weapon, particularly when wielded by women. What would men in authority look like if they stood by and let women kill themselves? And yet, what could they do about it? The Russians had an answer: forcible feeding. But this was such a horrible business, particularly when it involved male doctors interfering with female bodies, that the Prime Minister and Home Secretary shied away from it, crossing their fingers and hoping the hunger strikers would give up. There were soon 14 of them, imprisoned for things like smashing windows, and one of them was determined not to give up and die as a martyr if necessary. And she wasn't an ordinary suffragette either, but their most aristocratic member, Lady Constance Lytton. The government could not let her die and resorted to forcible feeding, despite the outcry from Millicent Fawcett, among others. Tubes were inserted through the nose or the mouth. A steel gag had to be fitted to force the mouth open. And even Emmeline seems to have wondered whether she should permit her followers, volunteers though they were, to go through it. An excuse for stopping it now presented itself. In January 1910, the constitutional crisis over the House of Lords forced the government to call a general election. Emmeline announced she was suspending her campaign to give the new government a chance to bring in a suffrage bill. But the election produced no decisive result and weakened Asquith's position. He agreed for a committee to be formed to draw up a women's suffrage bill, but this soon ran into the same old difficulties. It would need Conservative support, so the vote would have to be restricted to women householders. This was totally unacceptable to most Liberals and Labour. The vote would become a hobby for disappointed old maids who nobody wanted to marry, in the words of a female trade unionist. So the bill was changed to enfranchise wives of householders. But to many Tories this smacked of the dreaded universal suffrage. As the wrangling went on, Asquith, never keen at the best of times, decided that no more parliamentary time would be provided. Emmeline regarded this as a betrayal. On the 18th of November, she led a procession of 300 women down Whitehall and into Parliament Square. A powerful squad of police had been stationed there, with orders from the Home Secretary, Winston Churchill, not to let them anywhere near Parliament. What followed was far nastier than previous confrontations. The police wrestled with the marchers, punched them, pulled their hair, and allegedly pulled on their breasts. This sexual element caused a great outcry which spread far beyond the suffragettes, and the incident became known as Black Friday. Emmeline, whose own sister was shortly to die soon after being imprisoned, went to Asquith to protest. He refused to see her. There was now a second general election, no more decisive than the first. Again, a suffrage bill was introduced, and with the powers of the House of Lords now curtailed, stood a good chance of reaching the statute book. But once again, it ran into trouble. Emmeline could wait no longer. She ordered the militant campaign to start again. Windows were smashed, politicians' hats knocked off, and the hunger strikes began once more. But Christabel Pankhurst, increasingly an influence on her mother, wanted them to go even further, and Emmeline agreed. In 1912, a campaign of arson began. Pillar boxes and public buildings, including the Orchid House in Kew Gardens, were set on fire. Lloyd George's house was burned down. The suffragettes also began to use bombs, usually in the form of letter bombs to MPs, but there was an attempt to blow up the Theatre Royal in Dublin when Asquith was in the audience. Later the same day, someone threw an axe at the Prime Minister as he rode in an open carriage. There had been occasional one-off violent acts before, most famously the horsewhipping of Winston Churchill at Bristol railway station. But this was now an organised campaign, and debate rages still as to whether it should be counted as terrorism. 5 people died, accidentally, as a result of it, and it was more luck than anything else. There was no greater loss of life. The authorities at the time certainly regarded it as terrorism, and the special branch raided WSPU headquarters. Christabel fled to France. Her mother and the Pethick Lawrences were arrested and tried for conspiracy to cause property damage. Back in Holloway Prison, Emily decided she must show solidarity with her supporters and go on hunger strike herself. The authorities decided they couldn't risk force-feeding her and damaging her health, and so she was quickly released, only to be arrested several times subsequently, despite disguising herself and employing a squad of female bodyguards trained in jiu-jitsu. In 1913, the authorities came up with a horribly ingenious answer to the hunger strikers, what became known as the Cat and Mouse Act. After they'd starved themselves for a certain time, the women were released on parole, and then when they'd recovered their health, rearrested again. As the campaign of violence dragged on, divisions inside the WSPU became more obvious. When they questioned the strategy and Christabel's growing influence on her mother, the Pethick Lawrences were secretly expelled from the WSPU, although agreeing to go on praising it in public in order not to discredit the cause. A bit like the old Bolsheviks under Stalin, actually. Anyway, Adela Pankhurst was also disillusioned with the violence and committed the ultimate sin by going over to Millicent Fawcett's side. Millicent was horrified by the law-breaking of the suffragettes. "We are the law-abiding suffragists," she proclaimed. "We will only use reasoned argument to advance our cause. And we're a democratic movement, not like the authoritarian WSPU, a despotism as she called it." And although not romantic or glamorous, this was by far the more popular line. The NUWSS had 50,000 members compared with the 2,000 of the WSPU. Nonetheless, Millicent too was disillusioned with the politicians of the two mainstream parties and their failure to produce an acceptable suffrage bill, so she now decided on a bold move herself. She decided the NUWSS must affiliate to the Labour Party. This was an extraordinarily risky step to take. Millicent and most of her followers were conservative, at least with a small c, and here they were, attaching themselves to a small, left-wing minority party which few people then thought would ever come to power. But it was the one party which believed wholeheartedly in the cause of female suffrage. Ironically, of course, this is what Emmeline could and perhaps should have done. Sylvia Pankhurst, always the more left-wing of the sisters, was consistently urging her mother to take this step. The WSPU was too middle-class, she complained. It should reach out to working women, who had a whole host of problems apart from not having the vote. But despite her own ILP background, Emmeline refused. Emmeline's two daughters now moved in completely opposite directions, and she was forced to choose between them. Inevitably, she chose Christabel. In January 1914, having returned from a wildly successful tour of America, she summoned Sylvia, fresh from prison, to a meeting with Christabel in Paris, travelling there under an assumed name. There was an enormous family row, which ended when, with her mother's blessing, Christabel ordered Sylvia and her supporters to toe the line or face expulsion. Sylvia refused. She already had her own organisation, the ELFS, ostensibly a branch of the WSPU, and this now became a standalone socialist organisation, although still retaining the name suffragette. Sylvia was cast into outer darkness, while the other rebel sister, Adela, was banished to Australia. The campaign had now more or less been forced underground by police harassment, and was increasingly winding down into a series of pointless stunts. The most famous of them took place at the 1913 Derby, when Emily Davison, intending to gain some publicity with a Votes for Women banner, tried to run across the course as the horses were racing at full pelt, and managed to get herself, probably unintentionally, trampled to death. She became, inevitably, the great martyr of the movement. Other stunts included cutting telephone wires, etching Votes for Women with acid into the greens of golf courses, and the slashing of the Rokeby Venus in the National Gallery. This last attack indicates the way the movement, or at least Christabel, was moving. The problem, she decided, was not that men were denying women the vote, but that the male sex was intrinsically evil. Women should have nothing more to do with them, especially sexually. Votes for women, chastity for men was to be the new slogan. Had it been pursued, this would probably have destroyed the movement completely, but reality broke in, as it always does sooner or later. In August 1914, war broke out. This may have come as a blessed relief to Emmeline, who immediately suspended the WSPU campaign for the duration of hostilities, which of course lasted much longer than anyone anticipated. In return, the government declared a truce, all suffragette prisoners being released. Christabel now led a procession down Whitehall demanding not votes for women, but work for the war effort. And women, of course, answered the patriotic call in their millions. Emmeline spent much of the war on recruitment platforms, whilst also adopting 4 children, war babies as they were called, born out of wedlock to mothers whose sweethearts were subsequently killed. She grew more and more right-wing, particularly after a government-sponsored trip to Russia. Emmeline's autobiography had been widely read there, and it was thought she might be able to influence the revolutionary government to stay in the war. Shocked by what she found, she failed completely. Millicent Fawcett had much more of a problem during the war. She supported the war effort herself, but many of her supporters were pacifists like Sylvia Pankhurst and her group, and urged the NUWSS to oppose the war. Millicent refused to follow this line and struggled to hold her movement together, losing many of her oldest friends in the process. The war changed attitudes more profoundly than decades of campaigning had done. By 1918, it was agreed by even the most die-hard conservatives that, given their sacrifice, all servicemen should get the vote, and in practice that meant all men. Property qualifications disappeared. The old Chartist dream of universal suffrage was at last achieved. But if all men got the vote, how could women, given the role they'd played, be denied it any longer? So a bill was introduced to give